The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and cheap coffee, and Mara Voss sat very still while her cousins laughed. "A windmill," said Corin, wiping his eyes. "Grandpa Elias left you a windmill. Do you even know what that thing is worth? Nothing. It's a pile of rotting wood on a hill nobody wants." "He left me the house," said his sister Ilsa, smug in her tailored blazer, "and the vineyard, and the savings account. You got a broken windmill and 4 acres of weeds." The lawyer, a thin man named Mr. Havel, cleared his throat and slid a folder across the table. He didn't laugh. Mara would remember that later. The way his eyes lingered on her a beat too long before he spoke. "There is also this," he said, and placed an old iron key on top of the folder. It was heavier than it looked, dark with age, its bow shaped like a wheat sheaf. "Your grandfather was very specific. The windmill goes to you, Mara. Not the house, not the money. The windmill. And only you may hold this key," Corin snorted. "Congratulations. You inherited a key to a shed." Mara said nothing. She picked up the key and it was warm, though the room was cold. She drove out to the windmill 3 days later, alone, because no one else wanted to come. It stood at the top of Hollow Ridge the way it had stood for 200 years, leaning slightly into the wind, its 4 great sails long since stripped of canvas, its wooden bones silvered by decades of rain. As a child, Mara used to climb the hill just to sit beneath it and listen to the creak of the axle turning in the breeze, a sound her grandfather once called the mill breathing. He used to tell her strange things about that windmill, that it was older than the deed said, that his own grandfather had bought the land specifically because of what was already built beneath it, not because of the mill itself, that some inheritances aren't about what you're given, they're about what you're trusted to find. She had thought it was just an old man's storytelling. Now, standing at the base of the structure with the iron key pressing into her palm, she wasn't so sure. The door groaned open on hinges that hadn't moved in years. Inside, dust hung in shafts of amber light that slipped between warped boards. The great millstones sat silent, furred with cobwebs, and the wooden gears above her head, enormous toothed wheels taller than a person, looked like the ribcage of some sleeping giant. She almost turned back. It was, exactly as her cousins had said, a pile of rotting wood. But then she saw it, a section of the stone floor, near the base of the grinding mechanism, where the mortar between the flagstones formed a perfect square instead of the irregular pattern everywhere else. Someone had cut those stones on purpose. Her grandfather's voice came back to her from a memory 20 years old. Some inheritances aren't about what you're given. They're about what you're trusted to find. She knelt him and pressed her palm flat against the stone. It gave, just slightly. Like a held breath finally released. It took her 4 hours with a crowbar and raw stubbornness to lift the flagstone free. Beneath it was not dirt, as she expected, but a narrow staircase of hand-cut steps, descending into darkness that smelled of cold earth and something else. Something like beeswax and old ink. She should have called someone. She should have waited for daylight, for help, for anything other than the trembling flashlight in her own hand. But her grandfather had given this key to no one else. In a family full of people who would have sold the land within a week of finding anything valuable beneath it. He had trusted her. That thought alone pulled her down the stairs. The chamber at the bottom was small, circular, built from the same stone as the mill's foundation, but far older. Older, she suspected, than the mill itself. Wooden shelves lined the curved walls, and on them sat dozens of ledgers, their leather covers cracked but intact, their pages protected from a century of moisture by some ingenious system of copper flashing built into the stone. In the center of the room stood a writing desk, and on it, waiting as though someone had left it there yesterday, was a single sealed envelope with her name on it, in her grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Mara, if you are reading this, you found the stairs, which means you are exactly the kind of person I hoped you'd become. Someone who looks past what a thing appears to be worth and asks instead what it might be hiding. This mill was never really a mill, or rather, it was, but Grinding grain was only ever the excuse. My grandfather and his grandfather before him used it to keep something safe. Records, land surveys, water rights, deeds, and letters going back to before this valley had a name on any official map. When the county tried to seize common grazing land from 40 families in 1911, it was the papers in this room that stopped them. When a flood in 1954 destroyed the county archive, this was the only surviving record of who owned what, and it saved a dozen farms from being swallowed by developers who claimed the land had always been theirs. This windmill isn't worth nothing, Mara. It's worth everything, just not in the way your cousins understand value. I gave it to you because you were the only one who ever asked me why the axle turned even on windless days. You noticed something wasn't right, and you never let it go. That's the only qualification that ever mattered. The ledgers are yours now. So is the responsibility. Use them wisely. I love you. I always believed in you. Grandpa Elias Mara sat down slowly on the cold stone step, the letter trembling in her hands. And for the first time since the reading of the will, she didn't feel like the cousin who got nothing. She felt like the only one who had actually been chosen. It took 3 more weeks for the truth to fully surface. Because the ledgers, once properly examined by a historian Mara hired from the state archive, turned out to contain something far larger than family history. Buried among the property records was an original 1887 mineral rights agreement, one that predated every subsequent claim on Hollow Ridge and the land beneath it. Land that, as it happened, sat atop one of the largest untapped limestone deposits in the county. Corin and Ilse's vineyard, the house, the savings. All of it sat on land whose true value depended entirely on rights that had been sitting in a hidden chamber under a windmill everyone assumed was worthless. When the lawyers finished untangling it, the numbers weren't close. Mara's windmill and the ledgers beneath it were worth more than everything else in the estate combined. But that wasn't the part she thought about most in the quiet months that followed, restoring the mill's sails plank by plank so that, once again, on windy afternoons, its arms turned slowly against the sky. What she thought about was her grandfather's question. Why does the axle turn even on windless days? She had asked him that when she was 8 years old, sitting on the hillside watching the sails creak in a stillness that should not have moved them. He had smiled and said nothing, because the answer, she now understood, was never about wind at all. It was about air moving through a chamber hidden below, rising up through a hollow shaft built 2 centuries ago by men who understood something modern people often forget, that the things worth protecting are rarely the things that look valuable on the surface. Sometimes the truest inheritance isn't the house, or the money, or the land everyone else is fighting over. Sometimes it's a key nobody else was trusted to hold, and the quiet, patient curiosity to wonder what it might open.